朋友们，大家好，欢迎您收看本期的新闻追击。自疫情爆发以来，中国始终坚持清零政策。中国为了清零付出了巨大的代价，经济和贸易下滑，核酸耗费高昂，民怨沸腾，还面临着国际舆论压力。世卫总干事谭德赛5月10日表示，清零防疫政策不可持续。纵观全球，没有哪个国家像中国一样动用举国之力坚持清零。为何中国对清零政策如此坚定不移？今天的新闻追击邀请到了在美国的公共卫生专家，为您分析中国清零背后的政治逻辑和未来可能的防疫走向。6月8日，习近平在四川考察时指出，要毫不动摇坚持动态清零总方针，坚定信心，排除干扰，坚决巩固住来之不易的疫情防控成果。上海封城2个多月，乱象丛生，民生凋敝。北京等其他省市的清零风控也同样使民众失去正常的生活和工作环境。这种持续严苛的清零举措引发国内外质疑声音不断。为什么全世界只有中国一定要不惜一切代价动态清零
？I think China has chosen this path because it's become something of both a political imperative, but also still a legitimate public health risk. They have relatively low elderly vaccination. There's healthcare capacity in second and third tier cities in the rural areas is not great. I do think that there is a risk that if they do open up and they do reduce restrictions, that there will be a significant outbreak. You'll see an uptick in hospitalizations and deaths. Some hospitals will likely feel more pressure than they've seen to date, other than perhaps Wuhan in the beginning of the outbreak. And I do think so. There is a risk there.
如果放开疫情防控，中国的医疗体系会崩溃吗？
The healthcare infrastructure question is a longer, harder challenge. There are many cities that if they really did have a surge of patients, the hospitals, even if you are constructing these makeshift COVID hospitals, even if you are moving resources around the country, many of them wouldn't be able to manage that surge. And you can't really address that issue from a human resources standpoint, from a ICU capacity standpoint. You can't fix that overnight. That's a many years effort. It's been a priority for the Chinese government for over a few decades now. They're making progress, but to really create a healthcare infrastructure that is similar to many, say, European countries, it would take many years in some of these lower resourced cities.
罗森斯坦认为，封城之所以能在中国实施，取决于中国的制度和价值观。
The trade-offs for aggressive restrictions like you're seeing in China are incredible disruptions to individual freedom of movement. And they do have public health benefits, but the collateral damage is frequently significant. There is always tension between public health, which is a community-based approach, and human rights, which is an individual-based approach. And when you're locking people in their apartments, particularly from, say, a U.S. perspective, that is a human rights abuse that Americans and most people, in much of the world aren't comfortable with. For China, they have the political will to commit to zero COVID. They have the resources to roll out these aggressive lockdowns, and they have the compliance from Chinese citizens. So that that is the recipe for zero COVID that I think we don't see in much of the rest of the world.
中国国家主席习近平5月5日在主持中共中央政治局常委会时坚称，中国的防疫措施科学有效，并表示要打赢大上海保卫战。5月23日，中国国务院总理李克强主持召开国务院常务会议，表示要稳产业链、供应链，优化复工打产政策。坚决清零和稳经济大盘，哪个是当务之急呢？对此，似乎中国高层有意见分歧。那么这背后有什么政治因素？
Xi Jinping has pointed to China's response to COVID as an example of its superior governance system, basically saying that the Chinese response is superior to what happened in Europe and the US because of the political system that Xi Jinping is in charge of. And the reality is that much of the population agrees with that. Zero COVID remains relatively popular in most of the country. So even if there are sacrifices, the economic implications are still secondary. Now, I know that there has been some question around the priorities at the top echelons of leadership. I think that the recognition is that Li Keqiang's focus should be on economics. But if in fact those two issues collide, that public health and maintaining zero COVID will take precedent.
2021年，上海市生产总值为43214.85亿元，平均每天生产值为118亿元。因此，上海封控1天，经济损失118亿元；若封城60天，损失的 GDP 就高达7103亿元。封城期间，因为医疗不及时、食物短缺、孤寡老人无人照顾等带来的非正常死亡案例已出现多起。如何评估清零对控制疫情的作用，以及清零所带来的经济损失、次生灾害呢？能否在这两者之间找到平衡政策，以最大程度减少清零的负面影响
？The collateral damage from really aggressive lockdowns is a huge risk. It's one of the reasons why many public health advocates shy away from advocating really aggressive lockdowns like they're doing in China. The best approach is to manage the trade-offs and the balance of outbreak response, but also the second and third order impact of restrictions. And I think that's why you're seeing a lot of people suggest that China needs to transition to a more sustainable policy. So it is ultimately a question of trade-offs. It's a question of whether or not the lives saved and the protection that comes from these aggressive lockdowns is ultimately worth more than the collateral damage. And China's really struggling with that. For political reasons, there's very low likelihood that they'll really embrace some type of shift away from their current policy before, say, late 2022, but probably not into middle of or late 2023.
清零政策继续，核酸检测就会常态化。根据野村经济学家的估算统计，如果全国70%的人每2天进行一次核酸检测，检测费用将达到中国财政支出的8.4%。2020年6月，国家医保局发布，按程序将针对新冠病毒开展的核酸抗体检测项目和相关耗材纳入省级医保诊疗项目目录，并同步确定支付条件。然而，根据中新网的报道，城乡居民基本医疗保险基金出现收不抵支，2021年1到10月的结余为负6.3亿元。中国人口基数大，全民核酸检测的经济成本和医保基金的压力巨大。
The testing investment is in some ways a stimulus to parts of the economy, but it's also an incredible drain on the government coffers or on potentially on the wallets of Chinese citizens. And that really needs to get worked out because it will be very expensive and there will be a lot of efforts to deflect costs either onto other parts of the government, into the local medical systems. If it does land on individuals assuming the cost of those tests, the issue there is that a lot of those individuals will probably go out of their way not to get tested. And so then that will undermine some of the public health objectives.
中国政府未来什么时间才有可能放松清零政策呢？
My sense is that after Xi Jinping gets a third term in October, they will experiment with something that I call zero COVID light, where it's still a very strong commitment to smaller outbreaks, but it's a willingness to start the pivot, to start thinking about ways to transition to living with the virus. That again includes rolling out treatments very quickly, particularly to at-risk populations. It includes making sure that an overwhelming majority of the population is vaccinated and boosted, and then thinking about ways that you can shorten isolation periods and quarantine periods. You can shorten isolation periods for incoming travelers. You recognize that the best approach are the least disruptive interventions, things like vaccination, things like ventilation improvements, things like improvement in healthcare infrastructure. Those are the things you really want to focus on and not necessarily clamping down on individual liberty and individual movement.
观众朋友们，您对中国的清零政策是什么看法？您觉得中国能否有更科学有效的方式，在抑制疫情传播的同时，顾及到更多人权考量和人本关怀？欢迎您分享您或家人朋友在清零政策下的经历和体验，请您在视频下方留言，或通过反馈@rfa.org 联系我们。感谢您的收看，我们下期节目再见。